So this is an attempt to sort of provide a qualitative time series for over 2,000 plus years, which talks about this Dharma-based economic frameworks, so that we can draw inspiration as we move towards Vixit Bharat on how some of these ideas can be implemented, or at least how do we learn from some of the ideas. Because not only does it provide a sense of confidence, it also provides us a sense of perspective.
I've long said that those economists who do not study history and the historians who do not study economics do not understand either of the two subjects, because they are intrinsically linked, not in silos. Economics, politics, policymaking, all of them are ultimately downstream of culture. Because culture defines in many ways the framework in which we human beings think. All great civilizations have created certain anchors for thinking about the world. I'm not making here a case that everything has now got to be purely indigenous and we should go back to the beginning. But it is important to understand the course by which we came to understand ourselves.
Curiosity is also increased on who we are. And I think people make a better case. And of course, post 2014, I think, for the reasons that there's been a lot of interest as well. And I think this is bound to continue, irrespective of what the political landscape is, because at the ground level, there is indigenous support.
Before we begin the discussion on the book and get an idea from the author, the panelists, and our moderator about the ideas that have been brought in the sequel of another best-selling book by our author, Kautilyanomics, I would request our panelist author to kindly launch the book formally, please.
Good evening, everyone. An amazing session that is ahead of us. And I have known Sriram for some time. He's also visited the Rishi University campus for his first book talk on Kautilyanomics. And since then, we have been very curious about what he's going to write next, because he told us it will be a trilogy. And I think the next book is going to be on Vixit Bharat. So just to set the context of the discussion today, I don't know if many people got a chance to have a look at the book yet. So if Sriram, if you could tell us exactly what the book is, what motivated you to write this, so that we get a context of what we are going to discuss further.
And I think the first book, tried to provide a perspective on Kautilya's Arthashastra for 3rd century BCE text. It provided a sort of a framework, an economic framework to Kautilya's thinking, based on the idea of Dharmic capitalism, the idea of Dharma and its role in economic policy frameworks. So as an extension to that, I've, in my research, found that a lot of the common era kingdoms, such as the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Vijayanagara Empire, and entire Southeast Asian kingdoms in Cambodia and in Vietnam, all of them have some iterations of these Dharmic frameworks that I'm talking about. An extension of what Kautilya's Arthashastra was, and also some iterations and modifications along the way. So more and more as I researched, I felt the need for a sequel. And this book basically tries to cover till about 17th century CE through these kingdoms. And it focuses on 3 areas. One is on Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism. 2 is the Dharmic ecosystem, which is basically the temple-driven economies, which played an important role in a lot of these kingdoms. And lastly, the Sreni Dharma, the idea of corporate guilds and the role the corporate guilds played, not just in the social front, but also on the economic/political front as well. So the book tries to sort of provide a perspective on all this. And the broader inspiration is 2 things. I mean, I'm trying to research 2 key areas. One is, what is our economic history? Many countries have drawn inspiration, whether it's capitalism through the Protestant ethic, or the Chinese model of economics, or the Japanese model. All of them have derived inspiration from their past. Our inspiration has been limited to something like Swadeshi, which is a political philosophy. And there is very little sort of, rigorous thinking on this. So this is an attempt to sort of provide a qualitative time series for over, 2,000 plus years, which talks about this Dharma-based economic frameworks, so that we can draw inspiration as we move towards Vixit Bharat on how some of these ideas can be implemented, or at least how do we learn from some of these ideas. Because not only does it provide a sense of confidence, it also provides us a sense of perspective, because it provides almost such a continuous time frame of a framework which has been in existence. So that resilience of that is something that we could learn, I feel. And lastly, the role of culture and economic decision making. A lot of the research on this has been done in the West, but very little in Bharat, which is the cradle of cultural civilization. And I think that again has a very current context, how the role of culture and norms and narratives play an important role in economic choices by people, as well as for policymakers to sort of understand this more, so that you can implement more effective policy. So this is broadly the context, and yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sriram, for sharing that. I had a quick breeze on the book last night and today morning. Definitely a lot of primary research. I see that you have personally traveled there and have kind of documented a lot of this inscriptions that have been there and the history that has been. And I can see an influence of Sanjeev's thought as well, because the way he writes his books is also by doing primary research and going and seeing things and documenting it for himself. So I would want Sanjeev's comments on economic history, right? Typically in academics, the disciplines are so divided that economics is seen very differently from history. But why do you think studying economic history is important, and particularly from the indigenous context, right? We have not done a lot of that. So why do you think that Sriram's book at this time is important, and why we need to study the economic history as well?
So I've long said that those economists who do not study history and the historians who do not study economics do not understand either of the two subjects, because they are intrinsically linked. Indeed, all these silos which we have, politics, economics, sociology, all of these are academic silos for pedagogical reasons. We live in a world where everything is interconnected. So I think if you really want to understand the world, you really need to understand it in all its complexity and not in silos. So, I mean, many people ask me, oh, you're an economist as trained, why do you write about history, or why do you write about many other things? I say it's ridiculous to ask that question from my perspective, because all these things are interconnected. I mean, how can you meaningfully think about the world in a small box? Now, having said that, let me say that why is it important for us to understand ourselves? First of all, it is very important to remember that economics, politics, policymaking, all of them are ultimately downstream of culture. Because culture defines in many ways the framework in which we human beings think. It is the Overton window of our thoughts. So now, all great civilizations have created certain anchors for thinking about the world. I'm not making here a case that everything has now got to be purely indigenous and we should go back to the beginning. But it is important to understand the course by which we came to understand ourselves. Even if we're thinking in purely modern terms, in terms of today's India, you need to understand that even when we are thinking of things like property rights, if we are thinking of justice, these are all terms which have a certain meaning in our context, which is different from another context. And let me just define it one word so that you understand. Take, for example, the word nyay. Now, nyay is translated today because we use it for things like nyay pranali, etc. We call it justice. Nyay does not mean justice. Nyay relates to the process of reasoning. There is an entire school of Hindu philosophy called the Nyaya school, which is the rationalist school. And what do the Nyaya philosophers do? They basically created a framework and process of what is allowed as evidence, and how can you use a process of logical reasoning to come to a conclusion. So when you say in an Indian context that somebody has been given nyay, it does not mean that he has been given justice. It means that he has been given due process. Subtle difference. Now, yes, the idea is that if you properly go through due process, you arrive at satya. That is truth. So the idea in here for us is truth and not justice. So therefore, what is the equivalent of justice in our context? It is dharma. But dharma and justice are not the same thing. Dharma is a term which is used very widely, but very loosely speaking, for the context of this justice universe, it would mean that the right thing was done. Something to that effect. So, the Nyaya process arrives at truth, and presumably because you've arrived at truth, the right thing is done. That is our understanding of justice, which is very, very different from the conception of justice that we have. And I can give a long separate lecture of why this disjunction is, at least in part, the source of the problem we have with our judicial system. Because we do not distinguish between justice and process, whereas the entire thing is about Nyaya. And we think, therefore, Nyaya is a justification in its own right. It is not. It is purely protocol. So I'm just giving that an example that understanding your own cultural context is a very important thing for understanding why we do what we do. This is also true for understanding how we became. We are very proud as Indians of the fact that in ancient times we were the biggest and most prosperous country in the world, and for long periods of human history, we were the center of the world's economy. Now, did that happen with individual, merchants sailing off to Indonesia or to the Red Sea to trade and so on? No. This was a huge commercial enterprise developed over hundreds of years, which was on a massive scale. Massive enough that a full 1/3 of the Roman Empire's revenues came from import tariffs on Indian goods. Did you know this? It is incredible. Hundreds of ships used to go out, hundreds of ships used to come in, and this is only on the west coast towards Rome. We were doing this with the Arabs, we were doing with the Persia, and then of course there was the other coast where we were going to Southeast Asia, sailing all the way through to Korea, and then of course there were the land routes. Now, how was all this trade happening? Well, it was happening through, as Sriram has pointed out, through corporatized guilds. These were not small corporatized guilds thing. These corporatized guilds were manufacturing guilds, these were the artisan guilds, and then there were the corporatized guilds for merchants. And they had colorful names like the 500, presumably because they had 500 shareholders, I don't know. At least in the beginning, I think they had 500, and they just had the name, they had more. And they had operations in all over Southeast Asia, for example, and offices there. And they had their own navy. In some ways, we had an East India Company of our own running. And they were very powerful because, interestingly, you will see that some of these guilds would last for hundreds of years while dynasties came and went. Suggesting to me that these dynasties that came and went didn't mess with these corporate entities because they were powerful entities in their own right. And similarly, how did they get financed? Well, they were financed through a very complex system of financing, which included temple banks. So in case you were wondering why there was a large amount of gold in our temples, it was not because our kings were very pious and were handing over all their money to the temples. I can assure you that getting Indian politicians to hand over their money to anyone has always been difficult. Yes, some of the kings did build grand temples, much of it so in the hope that they would be remembered into the past, and indeed that is one of the reasons we remember many of these great kings. But the reason the temple banks had such a lot of money is because they functioned as financiers and venture capitalists for carrying out these great voyages in which this trade was done and all this wealth was brought back. They would finance the production of these goods. They would finance infrastructure. There are many temples in South India which still have copper plate contracts. They have contracts carved on the walls of some of these temples. This was also incidentally true all over India, not just in South India. The reason you don't remember too much of it about the remains are not there in North India was, of course, because many of these temples were destroyed. So in case you are wondering why Somnath had so much gold, well, just visit Somnath. It is on the coast. It was a major port. Right? Go and see Konarak. It's right next to the sea. It was a major port. All those shore temples of Mahabalipuram, why were they there? Well, Mahabalipuram was a port. It was the main port of the Pallavas. So they had temples and they had temple banks. And so this is the way in which all worked. Interestingly, contrary to later beliefs that people began to have, the Brahmins were at the forefront of much of this trade and would personally travel all over the place both to trade as well as to do financial deals. The 500, for example, was actually originally started by 500 Karnataka Brahmins. They were created that merchant guild. So again, this idea that there are some Dharma Shastras have that crossing the seas was bad, etc. Well, one of the interesting things about the Dharma Shastras is that never in our history were they considered canonical. They are one of many Shruti texts which contradict each other all the time, and they were never canonical. By the way, anybody in this room can write a Dharma Shastra. There's nothing canonical about it. They are not, they are Smriti texts, they are not Shruti texts. Shruti texts are canonical, Smriti texts are not canonical. Anybody in this room can write a Smriti text. So, there was this very different view of India as a risk-taking country exploring the world, trading, doing innovations in all kinds of fields. There's now a new book by Dalrymple which is attracting a lot of attention because he's talked about Indian ideas and innovations in science and technology and mathematics that travel around the world. But in fact, we were doing this in all kinds of other fields as well, in business, in political landscapes, and all kinds of other spaces all the time, over thousands of years. So I'm glad that Sriram has taken it upon himself to claw back some of this history and suggest that, look, this is what we did once upon a time. Now, this is not an attempt to say that now we should now begin to function based on that. It is simply to show that there was another way of doing things. There are certain lessons to be learned from it. It also shows that going into the future, we can also develop other ways of doing things which may have nothing to do with our own past or anybody else's past or current systems. I want to make this point rather strongly because very often our own images of our country is some sort of a rural, stagnant ideal which we ourselves perpetuate. And one good example of this is the idea of Swadeshi. Okay? So where does the word Swadeshi come from? I should know the history of this. It started in 1905 with the first attempt to partition Bengal. Okay? And at that time, many enterprises, many of them Bengali by the way. Today people don't think of Bengalis as entrepreneurial, but Bengalis have a long history of enterprise. And in 1905, large numbers of Bengali entrepreneurs decided to break out and create Swadeshi enterprise. But it was an entirely modernist effort. Okay, what they were trying to do is to say that Indians can create modern businesses. And out of that came Bengal Chemical, Calcutta Chemicals, Mohini Mills, this is just in Bengal, Sulekha Inks. This is in Bengal, but in other parts of the country also caught on to all of this. And it was a completely modernist venture. It's only in the 1920s that the idea, largely driven by Gandhi's own ideas, that this idea of Swadeshi went from being a modernist to becoming a Luddite thing about charkha, etc. The original proponents of Swadeshi were aghast by this. And in fact, Tagore wrote against this idea of Swadeshi, which he thought was Luddite and backward looking. So I'm telling you all of this because it is important that when we celebrate our past, it is to liberate ourselves from the shackles of the current way of that things are done by saying that there are other ways of thinking about it which are more rooted, but that rootedness is not some argument for some stagnant return to some past. It is in order to move forward. Now with that, let me hand it back to you, Shobit.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Always fascinating to hear from him. Many of those facts or our own history and how it has influenced the world and which we are not aware of. And Sriram also brings it out beautifully in his book through his research. And in recent times, I mean, through the spirit of social media, as well as a lot of books like this coming out of Sanjeev and now Sriram writing, that we are coming to know about these things. So I want to bring out the academic in Professor Malhotra. And as we speak, the Rishihood students are driving all the way from Sonipat to come and attend this lecture. So the challenge that we have as an academic institution is, what are those areas in which we can delve deeper? Like ideally, I would want this to be a textbook in our economics course, right? So what are those areas of research that you should think that the future researchers here should delve into, so that this brings it out in a more curricular format that we can use? Because for popular reading, it's always great, but I would want students here to be inspired by this book and take them up as research topics. So what do you think would those topics be that we should delve deeper? Because the subtext of this book is an indigenous and sustainable economic model. So you would want to establish that. So how would you want our students to take it up and go further?
Thank you, Shobit. In fact, I had the honor and the privilege of getting in touch with Sriram Balasubramanian when his first book was discussed from the platform of EGRO, Kautilyanomics for modern times. It is since then that we have been in contact, and when Dr. Subramanian wrote this book, we were talking about several things, and we did think in terms of this release also. I feel personally that one big thing I feel, and that provides us an answer to the question that you have raised. See, it's only in the recent past, in terms of, let's say, an educational policy, that we have started to talk in terms of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, right? And some of us have been talking about transdisciplinarity also. Though these words would definitely need further explanations, and here time will not be sufficient for me to explain the differences in those terms. I was complimenting Dr. Subramanian for raising one big issue. Most of the times when Indians have attempted, I've gone through many such works, and I had the privilege of being in conversation with Balbir Singh Sihag also, right? So we interacted on a couple of occasions also on his writings on Chanakya and Arthashastra also. So the point is, when you go for reading history, Dr. Subramanian very candidly admits in his work, and I have read many pages of this book because I received a copy of that much earlier, in fact. So he says that we are talking about last 2,400 or 2,500 years. But if we talk about the civilizational aspects, our history, known history, date back to 5,000 years. So there is a remaining period of 2,500 to 2,600 years, which would definitely require our further researches to go into. That's one thing. Angus Madison, who is one of the inspirations of all Indian economists taking over their own histories, in fact, again looks at a record of last 2000 or 2000, since Common Era only. He looks at that record. When we go for all such studies, one very big thing is that, as Mr. Sanyal very rightly pointed out, see, knowing economics without knowing your own history, your own culture, your own civilization, and I go a step further, your own languages of the past. Those of us who have traveled to the different country, they understand it very well. When you travel to Europe or many European countries, you'll find that many of their languages have been inspired deeply by Sanskrit. Right. Secondly, when we go for such kind of researches, understanding of Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, inscriptions, they would definitely require us to go a little deeply into that. And this is where the context of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity enters into the whole gamut of the things. One interesting thing that I would have definitely loved to see and listen and finds a glimpse of that in this book also is thus far we have been going about the empirical kind of things, maybe some data, maybe reading from certain inscriptions, right, some record somewhere. But Dr. Subramanian has ventured to give it a theoretical foundation somewhere. When he says Dharmanomics is a function of Kautilya Dharmic capitalism, and he writes it with dash and not plus. So those of us who are related to economics can very well understand the difference between Keynesians and the post-Keynesians on that count, right? The nature of relationship that it has. And then when he writes Dharmic ecosystem, and I was looking for a word which appears little afterwards, harmony, in this book. And I would have definitely loved to see both the explanations for harmony. Internal harmony and the external harmony. Perhaps when we were venturing with the idea of giving a new theory or thinking in terms of giving altogether a new theory or building a new theory, we perhaps think that we are taking a risk because the West has already given us a theory linked with other theories in economics, which provide explanation to one or the other phenomenon within the realm of economics. But we have seen over the last 20-25 years, the whole range of theories in West, especially imperfect information, asymmetric information, and we were talking about institutional aspects also. So they have been talking about all this. So they are all dimensions where deeper amount of research and a little more rigorous research and linking research, one aspect of research with the other aspect of research and involving, because the world of economics is getting too complex, or the world of every discipline is getting too complex and it is getting increasingly interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. If you ask me, you separate from economics today law and commerce, I cannot. You ask somebody from commerce to separate economics and law from that, one cannot. So it provides us answer to what kind of explanations are further needed. And I believe a complete, let's say, comprehensive work has to be defined to be undertaken. And this is how new collaborations and new research insights need to be generated in all these areas.
Thank you, Professor Malhotra, for sharing that. We have a lot of audience here, and I'm sure you have to ask a lot of questions. But before I hand over the mic to you, one last question from my side to Sriram is, this is one of the first book launches that you're doing in this tour, and I'm sure you'll get asked this question wherever you travel is, yes, economic history is important, and we need to know this, but how is it relevant for the future? The world is globalized, the world is industrialized after the Industrial Revolution. Are these indigenous models relevant? It's good to know, it inspires us. And it is also a prequel to your next book that is going to be Vixit Bharat, right? So how does this inform the economic models that we are working with currently, and how does it inform India's future journey? So if you could comment on that, and then we'll open it up for the questions here.
Thanks a lot for the comments, both Sanjeev and Dr. Malhotra. Just a couple of observations, right? So when Sanjeev mentioned about the temples, there's also one of the reasons why most of the big temples, they're all within an hour's drive from the coast. Even in Tamil Nadu, if you look at, except for the Madurai Meenakshi Amman temple, which is a bit inward, most of the other big temples, they're all, somewhere nearer the coastal areas. So one of the major reasons could be the financing part of it, because they played an important role in financing as well. Second, on Angus Madison, I think it's also important to sort of look at the Madison's research in perspective, right? One, of course, it's one of the few sort of Western scholars who've looked into it and provided us a perspective for which we're very grateful. But on the other hand, this sort of subject needs to be looked in a multi-dimensional perspective, right? Data per se is scarce and is also difficult to obtain. So just to give you some context, right? If you take the wealth in the Padmanabha Swami temple, it's almost equivalent to the GDPs of many countries even today, right? So how much of this stock of wealth, was part of the GDP is a different story altogether, right? So purely relying on data alone in this regard, I think is a bit short-sighted. So data is important, and on top of it, you have secondary research, which means going at the inscriptions, detailing the inscriptions and looking at the context of the inscriptions, and then the anecdotal, evidence, which is, Periplus of the Arthurian Sea, books like that, even the embassy notes, the Chinese embassy notes, and a variety of other things. For example, if you look at day-to-day lives, there is a small story of the Pallava kings. I think Sanjeev has also mentioned this before, where one of the Pallava kings was actually born in Vietnam in Champa. It's called Nandivarman II. The Kanchipuram Varadaraja Swami Perumal temple, which is a famous temple, was actually pioneered by this Pallava king. But the fact is, before him, there was a king who didn't have any progeny, so he passed away. And then he had a generation before him who had migrated to Cambodia and Vietnam.
4 or 5 generations.
Yeah, 4 or 5 generations before. So because of that, they had a lineage, and these guys once traveled all the way to Cambodia and Vietnam area to look for the lineage, and there were 4 children, right? And the first 3 did not want to take the throne. The 4th kid was Nandivarman, who was 11 years old. And he said yes, and he was made the king in Kanchipuram during that reign. And he became one of the biggest Pallava kings of the Pallava dynasty. Why I'm saying this is a very important sort of example, because it tells you that the common people who are very, open-minded, they had a sort of a global worldview. They were willing to accept, even people who are from outside, as long as, they were prosperous and things like that. And then the common person also was sort of engaging with the rest of the world, not just the elites, not just the, the so-called, the kings and their kith and kin. So it was sort of something which is percolating downwards. In fact, the Roman coins, a lot of the Roman coins, the second biggest discovery of the Roman coins after Europe was found in southern India in early CE. So there are a plethora of examples like this which can, indicate to this fact. So answering your question, I think one of the, sort of naysayers approach to this is, why do you study all this? Because they don't want to put in the effort, to do the rigorous work and explore all this, right? So I find that a very pessimistic sort of approach. Firstly, one of the major reasons to study all this is to gain a sense of confidence among all your students and among adults, frankly. In fact, people above 50 are the most pessimistic lot because they come from a worldview which is, pre-internet, which had all the walls of, biases which are not there today. I mean, 15 to 25-year-olds today are far more, abridged to wide range of knowledge. So I think one, it builds a sense of confidence, I think, which is very important as a civilization, as a society, for us to address some of the challenges that we're talking about. Second, in terms of economics alone, the fact that economics is a science which is dealing with people, right? And the choices that people make. Whether it's now or 5,000 years back, we are still human beings, right? Our context might have changed, our situations might have changed, but our decision making and our sort of approach to decision making and the things that influence decision making remains the same. So, and the fact that a lot of our day-to-day life and all our festivities and all that, which influence our discretionary spending quite a bit, are all influenced by this way of life for thousands of years. So the continuity of that, what we're having is a parallel track where a continuity of thousands of years defines our day-to-day lifestyle and our consumer choices. On the other hand, we have this sort of, modern template of what, needs to be an economic sort of framework, mostly from the West, which is sort of superimposed on us. So what we need to do is to try to understand this way of life and try to bring policy which is aligned to this way of life. Then it becomes a natural precursor for a lot of ideas that we see. So I think that is an important sort of perspective. That's how we need to view it. Like what Sanjeev says, I think none of us are saying that all of the past is, pristine. Obviously, there are a lot of flaws in the past. But before that, you need to understand what the past is, right? And what the frameworks for the past were. And these, monuments and, these, for example, the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, even today it is difficult to replicate the temple one-to-one. If you ask, the most engineers, it would be still difficult to replicate. What I'm trying to say is that it was not some random process. there was an articulated thinking, there was a sophisticated philosophy, and this was continuous and resilient for a long period of time. So for the future, the challenges that we have, you name it, climate change, sustainability, inclusive growth, redistribution, I talk about temples or redistributive entities, all of these has lessons that we can learn. And I think I can apply on even a case-to-case basis. Lastly, I want to wrap up with this in the sense we have the Mahakumbh, which is coming up in March. So if you take an example of the Mahakumbh, it is probably the largest congregation of humanity in a particular place. But it's also a great sample size for economic experimental design, where you could, whatever policies that you want to implement or align it to this way of life, you could take this as a great opportunity. So this is the sort of approach I think that would help, where you redefine approach to policy making in a way that is aligned to this way of life. Then it becomes an autopilot, because you don't need a state beyond a point, because people themselves sort of absorb into it, because the way of life is a natural sequence of events, whereas an imposition from the state is something different. So I think there are lots of reasons to learn about our past, and more importantly, do it in a rigorous scholarship-bound way. And there are lots of lessons also that we can learn, because for the next 15, 20 years, we are on the way to becoming a superpower, right? So which means our ideas, our thoughts become mainstream, not just for us, but for the rest of the world. So if these ideas can sort of emanate and provide you solutions for the rest of the world, then we are positioning ourselves in a much more sustainable manner where the world looks up to us. So I think it's a very important time for us to bring about these ideas and bring them to debate and discuss.
Thank you, Sriram. I think if I have to summarize what he just said, one is of course the inspirational aspect, right? That is, we feel a pride, a civilizational pride that we had done it under adversity. Also we did it. Secondly, though we think things have changed, things are all the same, right? I mean, you mentioned about the Kumbh towards the end. We don't know for how many hundreds or thousands of years it has been happening. So the civilizational continuity in our social and cultural life has always been there, right? So if we can learn these models, they're always applicable, though times have changed, but I think it's just a different way of doing these things, right? And if we have this civilizational lens, then obviously we'll find opportunities where otherwise if we don't have this lens, we'll not. You mentioned about the Kumbh, 40 crore people are expected to show up at Prayagraj in 40 days time. Imagine the possibilities. If we could understand this civilizational fabric of our country, then we can obviously work not just on research problems, on entrepreneurship issues, on various different models on this. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I want to add this point as well. It's just not for the economic sort of policy. You look at businesses, right?
Yeah.
You take the top 10 businesses in this country.
Yeah.
Almost 90% of them would be family-driven businesses in some form or the other, right?
Yeah.
And most of them, if you look at their decision-making, their thought processes, involve some level of what we're talking about, right? And it percolates all the way down there. In fact, when Mukesh Ambani was talking with Jensen Huang recently, he talks about Diwali and why it's sort of a new year, and that's when he starts new projects or whatever it is. So even for the most richest person, as well as to the common man on the street, the connecting thread is sort of these sort of Dharma-based economic frameworks. And I think understanding that more and more gives us a more sophisticated view of what these are. And then more importantly, these things you don't see it in other societies, right? For example, in the United States, most of the consumer expenditure happens during the Christmas and the Thanksgiving season, right? Which is just in November and December, right? Whereas in India, you have festivals across the year. And we do most of our discretionary spending across the year. So we are in a very unique spot where unless we do research about this, no one is going to come and tell us, what to do, because not that we are distinct, but our influences on the norms and narratives is far higher than any other, sort of developed country. If you look at the Chinese, the Japanese, for example, have a Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Economic History within the Ministry of Finance. So a lot of the East Asians look at their own past to sort of derive inspiration. I think we should also move in that direction.
So with that, I'll open it up to the audience. You can raise your hand, ask your questions. You can direct it to one of the panelists.
I have one simple question. Why do you think that, do you all, specifically I'll ask to Mr. Sriram and Mr. Sanjeev, do you think people are coming towards the indigenous rooted culture of Bharat and the reasoning of Dharma and Dharmic activities? And what brought this interest of the people, especially over the past 2 decades in India?
I think there are a variety of factors, right? I mean, one major factor is our exposure to knowledge has increased significantly, especially post the digital revolution. We are not closeted by NCERT textbooks. We don't have the biases that come with knowledge from newspapers and all that. Today we are exposed to a wide range of content, which means, that I think provides a lot of interest. Two, I think we also evolved in a sense in the 90s. We just liberalized. People were moving abroad. Gradually. And then the income scales also started increasing. People, one generation, multiple generations have been abroad, worked in a lot of many places, and their income levels have increased. So I think curiosity is also increased on who we are, and I think people make a better case. And of course, post 2014, I think for the reasons that that's been a lot of interest as well. And I think this is bound to continue, irrespective of what the political landscape is, because at the ground level, there is indigenous support. I mean, for my first book, for example, a fairly unrecognized author, it sold thousands of copies, which means that there's an appetite for even, for this among common people to understand more and engage with people.
I'll agree with that. And the point is that I think there's a growing confidence in Indians about themselves. We were a country that was occupied and brutalized for centuries by different groups. And we, in some ways, came to believe that we were in some ways inferior, partly because, long period of defeat begins to lead to self-questioning. But ironically, after independence, certain mindset was again, we imposed on ourselves, where we didn't allow the flowering of our own thinking. So ironically, Jawaharlal Nehru in his Independence Day speech says, soul of a nation long suppressed. But then after independence, that soul of a nation long suppressed, far from being allowed to flourish, was further suppressed by an intellectual class who did not have its roots in India or even in the freedom struggle, but in fact largely made up of foreign collaborators. People forget this, that you just look at the intellectual class up to the 90s, and it's almost entirely derived from those who had collaborated with the British or are direct descendants of those who had collaborated. So it is only in the last 20-25 years that a new group of people have emerged which have broken away from that. Yes, internet has been a very important part of that. Exposure, you will find that quite a few of the people who began to break out of this were themselves either educated abroad or worked abroad or something like that. So they began to be more confident because they could see that, hey, our systems are not so bad after all. They're as good or whatever as others. The success of, consequently, of non-resident Indians outside of India. And then, of course, more recently with the success of India itself, which is quite evident in a world of turmoil, we can hold our own. So I think these are things that feed upon themselves. So as we become more confident of ourselves, we are able to do this. And of course, we can invest into things that are also able. So we can invest into research. And I'll tell you about one project of mine, which is related to this, just to prove this point. I'm currently attempting to build an ancient ship. So a Gupta era ship from the 4th, 5th century, based on ancient texts, paintings from Ajanta and sculptures and so on. And it is a ship with a design which is derived from 1,500 years ago. It will not use any nails, so it will be stitched together. It's not a small ship. It's 21 meters long, so it's a reasonably large ship. And we are currently building it in Goa with government support and the Navy helping out. And hopefully by April, we'll have it in water. Then we'll test it for 6 months. And then the idea is that this time next year, we will attempt to sail it to Oman. And then if that succeeds, then we will take it to the other coast, to Kalinga, and then from there attempt to sail it to Bali along an ancient route, which is called the Bali Yatra. Many of you who know Odia history. So the question is, why am I doing this? It's not like I think we are going to have a major comeback for our stitch ships. No, I don't think stitch ships are going to become practical. At least I don't think so. But the reason it is important to do this is to show to ourselves, in a sense, prove to ourselves that, hey, they were these ancestors of ours who were willing to get out on these, wooden ships and literally sail out into the wild. All of us will be familiar with the enormous risks, say Columbus or Vasco da Gama and all these kinds of people did, or Neil Armstrong going to the moon. Well, you know what? Long before any of these people, there were Indians getting up in these stitch ships and exploring the Indian Ocean and beyond. So they were successful enough that about 2,000 years ago, a princess from Ayodhya was taken by ship to Korea, got married to a local prince, and essentially gave birth to the Korean history. So when you read Korean history, it literally begins with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. And the dynastic symbol of that period is, guess what? Two fish. Guess what? Even today, if you go to Ayodhya, the dynastic, the kingdom symbol of the kingdom of Ayodhya, even today is two fish.
So we had a delight of having you back in our university for Kautilyanomics, and we are here, indeed honored to have Dharmanomics. My question to you is that in your previous book, it was obvious that we had a long study of Arthashastra, Kautilyas. In this book, what attempt you have made to bring down those particular people that we can study over it? Because the challenges there, I believe, as an economics student, and that one thing is on education. These model has not yet explicitly shown in our model to study. Since IKAS government is making so much of effort, economics is still not has been touched over very much. And another thing is for young researchers to refer over the materials, where to refer, what to refer. And then finally is actually now, how can we, if you know that in pre-independent era also, there have been people like Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay. He has attempted for indigenous model of economic system, and also, we had Gandhian economics and Ambedkar economics, so on. So how practically we can implement this, indigenous model system?
So I think there are two things that you would find interesting in this book. One is inscriptions of references to the Arthashastra in a lot of these places, right? Which is again another fascinating thing, because Arthashastra, remember, is 3rd century BCE, and in Bharat itself, the text was supposed to be not there visible for a long period of time. It was, found again in early 19th century, early 20th century, sorry, so. How did this scripture, which wasn't, supposed to be visible, went all the way till Cambodia and Vietnam and things like that, right? So that is one, I would say, an interesting anecdote. Second is the role of inscriptions, right? Most people sort of think that what can you do at home, if you're not able to travel to all these places. But most of these inscriptions are all digitized now. So it takes a lot of effort. A lot of students can sit with your laptops and look at all these inscriptions if you want, and most of it is available online. ASI has uploaded quite a bit of them. A lot of private entities have uploaded quite a bit of them. So you can do a lot of working on these inscriptions. And of course, these inscriptions are very challenging because they're very prescriptive. They'll tell you, for example, say Rajendra Chola gave this much amount of money to this person at this interest rate, during this occasion, and it'll be very poetic and things like that. But what I'm trying to say is the information is all there. It's a question of research and work from individuals to look at it. So I think that is another sort of subtle team for researchers who can look at this and try to draw connections. And lastly, I think it's also important to understand sort of a thematic principle of how these things work, because they don't work in silos, right? They work in a multi-dimensional approach, and the politics of it. And remember, all these kingdoms were at literally war, politically within each other. But despite that, you had a sort of economic prosperity which is going in parallel, independent of this, which meant that there is a system which is beyond the realm of politics, which was sort of an undercurrent for them to implement and use. I think that's how I would see it as some of these lessons that we've learned.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम अनामिका है. मुझे ये पूछना है कि धर्म इकोनॉमिक्स और वेस्टर्न प्रिंसिपल्स जो इक्वालिटी के है, सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट के है, वो कैसे डिफरेंट है? एंड जैसे मैं हम सब एज डेलियाइट्स और एज इंडियंस पोल्यूशन की प्रॉब्लम फेस कर रहे हैं, तो क्या इशू वेस्टर्न प्रिंसिपल्स में है या हम उन्हें ठीक से इम्प्लीमेंट नहीं कर पा रहे? और धर्मोनॉमिक्स के कारण क्या हम वो बेटर सॉल्व कर पाएंगे जो मैं डे टू डे पोल्यूशन की प्रॉब्लम फेस कर रही हूँ, फॉर एग्जाम्पल?
First of all, one should not get too tied up in them. So, when you read, for example, the Arthashastra, it has traffic rules as well. Now, that doesn't, but those traffic rules are for bullock carts. That doesn't mean you take them today and try to implement it today. What you can do, however, is take the line of thinking, the principles or the way of thinking about something. That is useful way of taking it. And what is interesting to note is that Kautilya himself is not writing in ether. He's not the first economist in India. He himself quotes people who came before him, Brihaspati, Shukra, Manu, and so on, many others as well. So he's a part of a chain, and there are other economists who come after him as well, Kamandak and others, and many, many others which have not been translated, unfortunately. So one important thing you need to understand is that there is a long tradition of economics in India, and governance more generally. There were many principles that came. Many of these people disagreed with each other, by the way. Shukra Shukra school disagrees with Brihaspati school. Shukra school is all about dandaniti, law, enforcement of contracts and law. It has not much place for policy, whereas Brihaspati is more about policy rather than about dandaniti. So there are many. So who wants Varta, who wants Dandaniti, who wants Trei, etc. There are all kinds of disagreements. So first of all, when you say ancient principles, do remember not everybody agrees. Okay. Now, the next point is, however, there is a group of lines of thinking processes which are different from the Western line of process, even when they arrive at similar conclusions. So I'll give you one illustration so you understand. Both the Indian and the Western lines of thinking have significant discussion on why the state needs to be limited. Okay, at least since the last 300 years, since the Enlightenment, Western political, economic thinking has a strong strain on why the powers of the state should be limited. And it is derived from the idea that comes from Locke, Hobbes, etc., about the freedoms, inalienable freedoms of the individual. Yeah, that there are some God-given inalienable freedoms, which is why the state should not be allowed to encroach upon it. Okay. Now, Kautilya has a similar concept, but he comes from it from a completely different angle. Okay, he wants to limit the states because he thinks that bureaucrats are inherently corrupt. It's a very Indian view on why the state needs to be limited. Okay? So he starts by saying that just like it is impossible to tell how much water a fish is drinking while swimming around, in the same way it is impossible to tell how much misuse of power and how much money is being swallowed, government money is being swallowed by government officials. Now, both of them are reaching similar conclusions that the powers of the state must be limited. But the Western conception is arriving at it from the perspective of inalienable rights of the individual, whereas the Indian idea of limiting the state is coming from a suspicion of bureaucracy. So I'm just telling you that the principles are different. They both limit the state, but they do it in different ways.
Namaste, sir. In ancient time in Bharat, India, almost every household used to produce any kind of product like pickle, papad, achar. But now the majority household has become 100% consumer based. The tax percentage was very less, but now the tax percentage has increased exponentially. To encourage more production and more enterprises, and therefore result less black money. So sir, what are your thoughts about this, and how can we get in that era back?
So, one interesting thing, as I said, ancient India had many views on how economics should be. So, there would be one line of thought. I mean, there a lot of Indian thought is about ease of doing business and keeping taxes low. For example, many Indian texts mention that the king, i.e. the state, has the right to only 1/6 of the produce of the land, which means your tax system should be 16%. Yeah. So in some ways, modern India may be violating that principle. Similarly, there is a continuous mention that the best tax system is one where the taxes are collected in the same way that the bee collects nectar from a flower, i.e. without disturbing the flower, it collects the honey. So, these kinds of principles are repeatedly mentioned in the text. In the case of Kautilya specifically, it's very interesting. He mentions that if an official generates more if an official is given a certain target of what is tax collected, and he collects less taxes than that, he's to be punished. But interestingly, he also says that if he collects more than he's supposed to publish, he should also be punished. That means he is oppressing the productive capacity of the system. So it's very interesting that many of the things we debate today, are we excess taxing too much? What is the mode of taxation? What are the rules? Are we asking for too many KYCs? Whatever it is your grouse is. Many of these things were thought about even in those times. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. And by the way, not everybody agreed with every line of thought. For example, the Ashoka openly repudiated the Chanakyan model of governance. For example, Ashoka clearly says that, I am handing over my subjects to the Rajukas and the Dharma Mahamantas, which are government officials, to look after my people in the same way that a parent hands over her child to a wet nurse. So he is the origin of the Maibak Sakrar. So it is very interesting that ancient India didn't think very highly of Ashoka. In fact, the Mauryan Empire collapsed because of fiscal crisis caused by Ashoka. The idea of Ashoka the Great is a completely modern 20th century concept, and essentially was brought to the fore by Nehru as a forerunner for his idea of a Fabian socialist interventionist state. Chanakya would have been absolutely shocked that this is the model that was taken up by modern India. So I'm just pointing out to you there are many views about ancient India. They didn't agree with each other, and much of what we think today of India, how ancients thought and who are the greats, may violate many of the things what the ancients thought themselves.
With regard to Sanjeev's, mentioned iterations, right? I mean, if you look at Kautilya's Arthashastra itself, it is sort of like a manual, right? A set of prescriptions. I feel that Kautilya himself would have written this because he felt that the Babus and the government, they're not following a lot of the ideas. And then he said, look, I'll write a text, whatever that you guys want to pick it up, you pick it up depending on the context, situation, environment, right? So what I'm trying to say is, even in Kautilya's time, the kings and the implementers of policy probably had a different perspective to the advisors themselves. Yeah. And the idea in most of these texts is something that is iterative, which means you work over a period of time. I mean, a perfect example is, Sanjeev was the brainchild of the IBC, in our current context. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the way, it sort of iteratively progressed over a period of time. And that philosophy, I think, is also part of the mix, where you sort of allow a particular policy to sort of, it's almost jumping into the ocean, but still ensuring that you have all the safety apparatus there and evolving, evaluating the safetiness as you go along the way. And I think that's also an important inspiration, because in Dharmanomics, I also in a subtle way argue something similar, where, based on various ideas of Dharma, interpretations of Dharma, context of Dharma, things change. So one small example is between the Pallavas, between the Cholas and the Pandyas. The Cholas had all their ports along the coast, Nagapattinam and the southern coast. And these were transient trade ports, something like Singapore, for example, right? You are moving from one place to another, you want to sort of put your ship somewhere and then move. So for a lot of the Middle East folks who want to come to the rest of Asia, it was sort of a transient port. On the other hand, the Pandyas were more inland. So they had their ports which are just for trade alone, not for transient nature of the ports themselves. So what I'm trying to say is even within these kingdoms, some of them had, topographical changes, geographical changes, but they sort of iterated the model. They didn't fixate to a particular model. They had first principles, right, based on the idea of dharma, but they iterated along the way. And for all you know, in a different context, different scenario, they might even disagree with their own views. But their first principles were similar.